A new phase for the U.S. in Iraq.
We are not going to be, by the end of the year, in a combat mission.
Mr. President.
President Biden announces the withdrawal of combat troops. What legacy will the U.S. be leaving behind, and what might fill the vacuum after the Americans' departure? Plus,
it's an invisible attack. It's an invisible attack against democracy.
Revelations from the Pegasus project. Could the biggest surveillance scandal in modern history put an end to the use of spyware? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. U.S. President Joe Biden has struck a deal with Iraq's prime minister to complete the U.S. combat mission in Iraq by December. The announcement from the Oval Office on Monday signaled the formal end of an 18-year mission and a major shift in U.S. foreign policy. Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi says Iraq has no need for U.S. troops anymore because Iraqi forces are capable of defending their country. In March 2003, a U.S.-led coalition invaded Iraq, claiming Saddam Hussein was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. Saddam was eventually ousted, but no such weapons were ever found. Now, Biden says Washington's new role will be to train and advise Iraqi forces in their fight against terrorism. This was also how the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan began, and by the end of next month, the last U.S. troops will conclude that mission as well. But with the Taliban back in control of half the country, many wonder if the Afghans have been left any safer. And similar questions are being posed about what fate Iraq might face. Here's what Iraq security specialist Talha Abdul Razak says the U.S. leaves behind.
If we look at the legacy of the United States and what they've done in Iraq, it's a legacy of lies based upon false allegations of weapons of mass destruction. They've torn apart a sovereign country, which, despite the fact that it was ruled over by a dictator, still was independent. And yet now it's divided along ethno-sectarian lines. We have militias who run public office. They run and control the budgets of entire ministries. We have Shia religious fanatics running amok. We've got Sunni extremists like ISIS, who managed to infiltrate and conquer large parts of Iraqi territory, only to be pushed back by the same Shia jihadists I just mentioned. And overall, it's the Iraqi people that have suffered. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who have died.
Let's get another perspective now from Washington, and retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt joins us. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State who served in Iraq and was the chief military spokesperson for coalition forces there. Thanks so much for being with us. We appreciate it. I first want to get your response to what Talha Abdul Razak said there. Knowing that your fellow service people sacrificed and died in Iraq to create a country that he says is now significantly worse off.
Yeah, well, first I'd like to clarify, it has not been an 18-year mission. The United States arrived in 2003 and left in 2011. At the request of the Iraqi government, we came back in 2014 to help them in their fight against Daesh, and that fight is coming to an end. So the United States is transferring a lot of the responsibility, if not all of the responsibility, to the Iraqis. Now, regarding the comments that our other guests made, that's certainly a Sunni perspective. That's certainly the way that the Sunnis, who used to dominate the country and persecute both the Kurds and the Shia, would feel about the way things are now, since they are no longer in control and no longer in power. There's a completely different view of what he said, and I think the view on the ground is much different from Baghdad than it is from London.
It's interesting, though, because the Shia perspective, some will say, is actually even more counter to U.S. interests and what the U.S. had hoped to achieve. I mean, now people are saying that U.S. troops pulling out actually gives Iranian forces the chance to move in and take over to an even greater extent than they already have.
Well, it's certainly the case that Iranian influence is in Iraq. It always has been. You can't be a geographical neighbor with a country without that country and your own country having influence across the borders. We are concerned about that. We are concerned about the amount of Iranian interference. When you have Iranian-backed proxies, Iranian militias that are not only creating havoc inside the society, but also outwardly providing support to Shia militia groups that are going against American soldiers and American diplomatic facilities, that is a problem. That was an issue that was brought up this week in the strategic dialogue.
Right. I mean, and that is the argument. You know, Saddam Hussein was not a friend, but many argue he kept bigger Iranian-aligned enemies at bay in a way that today's leadership cannot, because Iraq cannot eliminate the sectarianism that allows for dangerous Shia jihadists to function.
Well, I certainly wouldn't call them Shia jihadists. They're all obviously Shia militias. The jihadists are ISIS, which is primarily a Sunni-backed organization. So I think the point is that there are numerous groups inside of Iraq that are fighting, but I would say that the solution is not returning to a dictator who subjugates the majority of people inside the country, commits genocide against one, and crushes revolutions in the other. So again, I think the alternative to today would be a Saddam-like character, and that would make things far worse. Okay,
but this is supposed to be really about U.S. security. That was the argument, that the United States was going in to protect U.S. interests. In 2003, though, people actually argued that eliminating Saddam Hussein would instead directly benefit Iran. And now, 18 years later, Iran is essentially getting another victory in Iraq. And Tehran is also getting what it wants in Syria, and they have Hezbollah in Lebanon. Has the U.S. only succeeded, in a sense, in making Iran stronger since the 2003 invasion?
Well, I'd turn that question back. If you think the solution to holding back Iran is by maintaining tyrannical, murderous dictators in power, then you and I disagree.
Okay. I guess, but I do want to go back to the issue of U.S. security. This is why the United States was going into Iraq in the first place. And instead, we saw a degradation of security and a creation of a safe haven of sorts for Daesh that eventually took control of Iraq's second biggest city of Mosul. And now, many fear that a security vacuum will be created once U.S. troops can completely pull out to give both Daesh and al-Qaeda a chance to create greater safe havens in Iraq, because they believe U.S. security forces Iraqi security forces alone cannot keep the country safe.
Well, let's be clear about what has happened since the defeat of Daesh by the Iraqi security forces. The U.S. contribution right now is 2,500 troops. They're doing primarily non-combat missions. They're providing intelligence, they're providing logistics and training support. The blood and the treasure that is being expended to keep Daesh out of the country is Iraqi blood. So what we've seen this week is an agreement between President Biden and Prime Minister Khatami to bring back, by the end of this year, a very small number of combat forces. The non-combat technical assistance forces will remain there. So in my view, as long as those troops remain, the technical troops remain, to fill the vacuum, the technical vacuum in the Iraqi security forces, then we'll be fine.
Okay, can you give me, out of curiosity, a number on that? I mean, 2,500 troops remain at this point. How many exactly will be pulled out?
I think it will be certainly less than 250. Again, the vast majority of these troops are technical troops, logistics troops. And it actually may be the case that we add more technical troops in there. And let's also remember there's a NATO training mission in there. There's a NATO mission in Iraq that is providing much the same type of support as the Americans are. And they're from every NATO country, and they're making a significant contribution in the training and education of the Iraqi senior leadership as well.
Okay. Let me ask you a follow-up question then again, specifically about U.S. security. What worries you more at this point? The lack of a U.S. presence in Iraq or Afghanistan?
I would say for the long-term security of the United States, if in Afghanistan it returns to being a safe haven and a sanctuary for terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. Obviously, we should be far more concerned about Afghanistan. We're seeing great problems within the Afghan National Security Forces. We're not seeing those problems with the Iraqi security forces. Al-Qaeda is a worldwide organization. ISIS is, to a great extent, localized. In Afghanistan, they have not been able to control the Taliban, and they would have a hard time if the security vacuum in Afghanistan allowed Al-Qaeda and its affiliates to come back. We see no evidence of that happening inside of Iraq, primarily because of the capabilities of the Iraqi security forces.
Right, and correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to be another element in that if need be, U.S. forces can technically go back into Iraq to assist. That might not be the case in Afghanistan if the Taliban continues to make gains.
Well, that's true, but at the negotiating table, the Taliban have made a promise to control the introduction of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups inside of Afghanistan. So let's see if they live up to their promise. Our promise was, if you do that, we will leave. But if they're incapable of living up to their promises, there's no obligation for the United States to live up to theirs.
Okay. General Kimmitt, you know the trajectory of the Iraq War in detail. And it was initially, as we said, about preventing Saddam Hussein from acquiring and using weapons of mass destruction. That did turn out to be a false premise. So tell us, after this many years, what did the United States really gain from deposing this dictator?
Well, first of all, it wasn't a false premise. It was simply bad intelligence. Every intelligence service in the world believed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And in the wake of 9/11, where we had been attacked by jihadists that killed 4,000 Americans, the decision that was made by the administration is we can't take that risk here in the United States again. We can't play defense. We've got to play offense. And that's why we decided to fight terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction by fighting forward. It's hard to say what the United States has achieved. I think the simple answer, but it is a wrong answer, is that we haven't been attacked in a significant way since 9/11. I think it's more subtle than that. It is certainly the case that if we could do a do-over, we would, knowing what we know now. But when you have the United States Congress looking at the same intelligence that the president is and overwhelmingly vote for authorization for the use in Iraq, I would say it wasn't just the Bush administration, but the United States Congress and our intelligence services that felt that same way.
Okay. Mark Kimmitt, thank you so much, as always, for being with us on the Newsmakers. We appreciate it. Now, an investigation conducted by Amnesty International and 17 media outlets in 10 countries has revealed that governments around the world have used surveillance software known as Pegasus to spy on human rights activists, journalists, and world leaders. French President Emmanuel Macron and murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi are among 50,000 on a leaked list of phone numbers allegedly of interest to governments using the spyware. Now, Israeli cyber intelligence firm NSO Group insists it only licenses its Pegasus software to vetted government clients for the purpose of tracking terrorists and criminals. But Amnesty International argues governments are using it as a weapon to silence dissent and claims its use is a violation of human rights and international law. In a statement, Amnesty International Secretary General Agnes Callamard says NSO Group has operated on the fringes of legality for too long and needs to be shut down. NSO cannot claim it did not know. It has been warned repeatedly about surveillance-related violations carried out by clients using its software. Countries with a proven track record of violating human rights and silencing critical voices, yet NSO actively chose to supply these governments with its surveillance technology. As such, NSO is complicit in the human rights violations carried out by these states and enabled by NSO spyware. Now, NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden says no phone is safe from hacking, and along with human rights groups like Amnesty International, he's calling for a global ban on private spy software. Well, to discuss all of this, I'm joined now from Perth, Australia, by Paul Haskell-Dowland. He's an Associate Dean in Computing and Security at the Edith Cowan University's School of Science. And Stéphane Dugan joins us from Geneva. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Cyber Peace Institute, an NGO whose mission is to ensure peace and stability in cyberspace. Thanks both so much for being with us. Paul, I'll start with you. First, can you just give us a better sense of really how serious you think this is? And we have to remember governments have always spied on what they see as their adversaries. They used to place recording devices in people's homes or tap their phones, etc. Why is this so different?
Absolutely. So we've seen, obviously, in the James Bond movies, the plethora of surveillance technologies that are believed to be available to government agencies around the world. And what we're seeing in the Pegasus software incident is a piece of spyware which is very easy to deploy. So imagine that you have received a text message and that text message seems innocuous, but in the background, it has deployed malicious software to your mobile device. Software that not only is spyware, it is there designed to intercept and monitor communications, but it can see absolutely everything you do on your device, every communication, both current and historic. It is an unprecedented level of interception and interference on mobile devices and is deployed with what's called a zero-click attack. There is no intervention from the human. We've seen incidents in the past where it's been simple technology, sending messages that you click on links to deploy the software, and it relies on social engineering to convince people to install that particular software. But in this case, we're talking about simply receiving a text message or an iMessage if it's an Apple device, or in some older attacks, a WhatsApp phone call coming through. And it's
Okay.
simply the process of receiving that that deploys it.
Right. I mean, we do understand how it works. I mean, it's very, surreptitious, and obviously the owner of the phone is not aware. But that's always been the case, as I was saying, Stéphane, with spying. You know, when your house used to be bugged by the Secret Service, you didn't know that was happening either, and they could listen to and potentially watch with hidden cameras whatever you say. Stéphane, I mean, do you find this, though, significantly more sinister than traditional forms of spying? What is it about this that is so bad that the whole system, the whole industry now deserves to be shut down?
I mean, it's not something new when it comes of modus operandi. It's been for years now that civil society organization and others are raising the alarm for a very specific business model, the offensive cyber capabilities business model. And where it's quite grim, it boils down to companies, so private companies, to decide who develop, who purchase, and who is using specific spyware in order to conduct malicious operations. So it's private industry that is deciding who is spying on who, with what capabilities.
Right.
And that's quite a difference.
That's the difference. And I mean, the company, the NSO Group, argues that it's a case of their good software falling into bad hands, and that they've vetted their clients, but they can't control what's done beyond their due diligence. Stéphane, is that fair?
Now, there's not any such thing like a neutral technology. Technology comes with a responsibility and with a clear need and obligation for due diligence. So we've seen that in every corner of the cyberspace. We need to understand that companies like NSO, because there's more than NSO, we call NSO today, but it's a quite a wide business. They are making the internet insecure, because their whole business model is based on the fact that there's vulnerabilities in the internet that they need to find before someone else, not to sell it the high price to anyone that wants to spy and can afford it.
Okay. Paul, let me ask you, what about the expense of this kind of hacking and monitoring? It does not come cheap. So, whoever is employing it has to really want to track its target. And therefore, we shouldn't really all be in fear of this technology, at least right now.
It's certainly true that the current...
Paul, go ahead.
It's certainly true that the current software that we're talking about, the Pegasus spyware, is realistically only available to government entities with very deep pockets. But the reality is that once these technologies are out in the wild, once people get to know about them, it's very likely that they will be adopted by the criminal fraternity as well. It may not be something they can do today or tomorrow, but it will happen in the future. And a good example is to look at what came out of the NSA with their spying tools that were being deployed. Once they got released and public knowledge was made available about the tools, the techniques, the approaches, and the vulnerabilities they were exploiting, it triggered a significant use of those particular vulnerabilities, those particular tools across the globe. So much so that we had entire genres of malware being created that utilize those vulnerabilities. So whilst it might be a minor issue at the moment, albeit 50,000 plus names that we know of, it is a very select group of individuals who've been targeted, but it's very likely that these technologies would be utilized by other individuals, potentially other governments outside of the control of NSO, once they have identified ways to misuse these same
Right.
vulnerabilities. But it's when the criminals get hold of it, we have to be really concerned.
And that technology naturally will get cheaper as time goes on. The flip side of that, though, is the new apps that are becoming more and more available to check for this kind of spyware. I mean, Stefan, does that give you any sense of comfort knowing that there will be a way to combat the spyware more so as time goes on?
It's a technical race. I mean, it will be. I mean, there's a lot of forensic capabilities that exist in order to detect this type of spyware, but that's quite high end and it's not an easy one. So, hoping that you have a plug and play app in order to detect this kind of attacks is, I don't think this is really realistic in the short term. What is important to say is that this business model is looking into flows, insecurities of endpoints or platforms. So that's where action needs to happen. It's in regulating this kind of activities and making sure that before there's a strong regulation and a clear oversight, then there's a moratorium to say, okay, we just should stop this business model.
Okay. Paul, let me ask you this. This is what worries a lot of people, and including me. I mean, how could all of this actually affect journalism? Using our phones, as we all do, has suddenly become a liability. In today's terms, I guess it's like not wanting to take notes or carry a pen and paper because you fear the information could be watched or even stolen.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no easy solution to this at the moment. We do have techniques that can be used, as we just heard it from a forensics perspective, to determine if a device may have been compromised. It's still not an easy guarantee to check for these things, but it's the fact that it requires that technical skill to be able to investigate. So in a journalistic sense, you could have your IT department looking for the indicators of compromise, the things that show that a device may have been compromised. But when you look at it at a global scale, the ability for journalists around the world to be confident in the technology they're holding is very limited at the moment. You simply don't know whether you are safe to continue to use these devices. Maybe it will encourage a resurgence of dumb devices as we revert to less technical capabilities, which of course have other mechanisms for spying and interception.
Okay. Stefan, let me ask you, is there a way to find a better balance here then in not having to shut the entire industry down? Because it can be used for good, as we know. If it is used to track organized crime, find terrorists that prevent attacks in the future, what could be potentially a mechanism to make sure that if it is sold, that the due diligence is done properly and that there are mechanisms in place so that the clients have to swear that they will not use this against journalists, against human rights activists, and will have to suffer penalties if they do?
Well, for civilians to be compliant with human rights, it has to be a two-way street. If there's a huge power from the states in order to survey or to spy on other states or the citizen, there should be a strong oversight democratic oversights from whatever the state is doing by the citizens. So that's the only way. Today, this is not happening. Today, we have a business model where industry is deciding where it sells spying capabilities. We don't have any oversight into how these sales are done, how these exports are happening. It's absolutely opaque how the states are using this and who are the targets and what is the selection process. So at the end of the day, today, this model, every dollar that is spent to invest into offensive cyber capabilities is a dollar that is invested in weakening the security of the internet. And to your question before, then it's a divide. Who can pay for their protection and who can't? And normally, last time I checked, some journalists or NGOs, we are servicing NGOs, our beneficiaries are NGOs, they don't have the capacity to scale up the IT services to defend themselves against such a threat.
Stéphane, I will let you have the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. Thank you both so much for joining us, and to our viewers for being with us as well. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.